It wasn't for lack of information. It was a lack of imagination of what happened here. We had all the information. We knew everything that was happening, but we couldn't put it together. The challenge for us was, or the failure, was how we were so in love or in belief of this idea and this conceptio, what we call it here in Israel, that Hamas did not want war, was deterred. Hamas wanted economic prosperity, that we had the right defenses, that if there would be something, we would have intelligence. And if we didn't have intelligence, we would have a fence. And if we didn't have a fence, we would have soldiers. And all of that was wrong.
Good morning. That familiar voice is State of Tel Aviv and Beyond regular guest, Ya'akov Katz, summarizing what went so wrong on October 7th, 2023. With his co-author, Amir Bohbot, a longtime friend and military correspondent, as Ya'akov once was, he has written a must-read book that chronicles what happened on October 7th. It's called While Israel Slept. Ya'akov and Amir have researched meticulously the many big and small things that went wrong in the years, months, days, and minutes leading to the Hamas attack on Israel 2 years ago today. They have written a fair but searing indictment of Israel's political, security, military, and intelligence leadership. This is the second interview that I did with Ya'akov about this book. The first was in August before it was released, but he was abroad and the quality just wasn't up to our standards. I thought that October 7th, today, the second anniversary of the still incomprehensible horror, would be an appropriate time to share the second interview that I did with Ya'akov, which was just 2 days ago on Sunday. So here we are. The majority of our listeners are in North America, and you're waking up now, just as I did when I was in Toronto 2 years ago, October 7, 2023. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Let's do this. Sunday, October 5th. Good morning, Ya'akov Katz. Thank you so much for joining the City of Tel Aviv this morning.
Great to be with you, Vivian.
Always a pleasure to have you. You're back for a while now from your book launch trip. And of course, that's what we're going to focus on, is talking about your outstanding book, While We Slept. Subtitle again, please.
While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East.
Love it. And boy, do you and your co-author, Amir Bohbot, really get into the detail and spare no one. So I'd like to talk about the book, the launch, and of course, leave a few minutes at the end to discuss this very dramatic moment in which we find ourselves, of course, on the cusp of October 7th. Unreal. And not life in the Middle East, right, Ya'akov?
That's what I was thinking. It is unreal, but it's also this crazy place we live. Yeah.
Unbelievable. So let's start first with the book itself. I know you had a tour, book tour, launch tour in the UK and the US. Don't believe that you managed to hit any points in Canada, but you're on the bestseller list. Have I got that right?
The book made it to one of the national bestseller lists, which is, always something you strive to achieve as an author. But
congratulations.
Thank you. I mean, look, if I have to think why, I'd like to think that we did a good job at marketing it and we wrote a good book and, people were interested. But I think that really at the heart of it is something that is deeper. And that is that after 2 years, still, there are so many people in this country, in this world, right, who are desperate to understand what happened. How did the mighty Israel, the ever vigilant Israel, the Israel that is able to do amazing things. Look at what we did, a year ago with the pager attack and the killing of Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah. Look what we did with Iran back during the 12-day war in Iran. How did this happen? And that really just that black hole, that mystery is still so raw and real for so many people.
Yeah, and in some ways, it may be even deeper and more raw with time as things are left unresolved and unanswered. It's just, I live, as you know, in the region, in the area close to the Gaza border where this all went down. And it's just in your face every day. It never goes away. And I feel that it does become more intense. So let's go back and talk about what happened while Israel slept on the night of October 6, 2023. What happened, Yaakov? At 6:30 in the morning on October 7th, 6:29, all we know is there was a full-scale attack by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and thousands of civilians from the Gaza Strip, criminals, whatever. Anyone who comes in and loots and kills and rapes and burns people alive, in my view, is a criminal. Start with Friday night, because there were signs and they were ignored, explained away, and then we can go back and forth as necessary.
I do think it's just important because you kind of touched on this. There's the very tactical level of what happened, but then there's the deeper level of how did we even allow this to happen? How did we misunderstand what was happening? And how did we fall into what we call the conceptia, or what I like to call the fairy tale? How did we come to believe in a fairy tale that a genocidal jihadist terrorist group could live on our border and they could be bought off with money? And they could, if I told you, for example, Vivian, hey, we're ending the war not with Trump's 20-point peace plan. We're ending the war by asking the Qataris to every month transfer $30 million in cash to Hamas in Gaza, and we're going to buy quiet. You would say, Yaakov, you should be institutionalized because that's insane. But that's what we did for 5 years from 2018. So
I have to interject. No one asked me during those 5 years, in my defense.
I understand. No, and there were people who were opposed to that 100%. Yep. But the majority, the government, this was the policy of consecutive governments, was the policy of the defense establishment and the intelligence agencies. This is what everybody thought was the right thing to do. But to your question, Friday, alarm bells start to go off, right? There were warning signs that something was amiss and something was happening in Gaza. The first was this story of the SIM cards. About 100 Israeli SIM cards suddenly go live inside the Gaza Strip. It means one of two things. Either suddenly 100 Israelis are inside Gaza, which would not be good, or that 100 Palestinians are preparing potentially to enter into Israel, and they want to continue to have the ability to communicate, so they're switching their SIM cards. But then when Israel looked back, the intelligence agency, Shin Bet, and military intelligence known as Amman in the IDF, looked back. They saw that about a year ago, right around the same time, if not the same day, Hamas had also tested less, about 30 SIM cards, a few dozen. Maybe this was the annual oil checkup for their SIM cards. Later that night, throughout the night, in the middle of the night, suddenly we start to see that they're uncovering underground rocket launchers. This could mean that they are preparing to launch rockets into Israel. But then we intercept a phone call between Islamic Jihad senior commander and a Hamas senior commander, where the Islamic Jihad senior commander says to his Hamas friend, "What are you guys doing? We see that you might be preparing something." No, this is just a drill, he reassures his friend. We intercept this call. So in our assessment, in the intelligence agency's assessment, it's a drill, which fits in with the narrative that we heard before about the SIM cards, the annual drill of the SIM cards. Then we see they're preparing underground bunkers and tunnel systems for their top commanders, people like Mohammed Def, who was the military commander of Hamas. All of this is happening. And all throughout the night, what surprised me when we did the research in this book, Amir and I, was literally not just that there were the alarm bells going off, but the flurry of activity that was going on, the number of calls that the chief of staff was on, that the head of the Southern Command was on, that the head of the operations directorate was on, with the head of the Shin Bet, Ronain Bar, how he even goes to headquarters in Tel Aviv, how he dispatches an elite squad of his most top commandos called the Tequila Squad, very small group. They weren't able, when the invasion began, they weren't really able to do anything because they were just a handful. But everyone was aware something was happening. And it was just all misinterpreted. It was, if I could borrow a line from Donald Rumsfeld, it was the Secretary of Defense back in the Bush era. It wasn't for lack of information. It was a lack of imagination of what happened here. We had all the information. We knew everything that was happening, but we couldn't put it together.
And I think it's important to just introduce the issue of technology at this point and the degree to which the IDF and the political echelon, the government, had come to depend absolutely on technology and on our multi-billion-dollar fence that was basically seen to have superpower abilities to repel any kind of attack. So just explain, please, what was that fence? What is that fence? And at the end of the day, how is it that thousands of Hamas terrorists literally cut through the razor wire and other fences, took out with attack drones the cameras that were meant to supervise or survey the border, and just drove their motorcycles overland? Not a single tunnel was used in this attack.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the over-reliance on technology is one of the huge failures of this war, or of October 7th. And it's a little more than just the fence, because when we look at it, what eventually was cultivated and created over time vis-a-vis Gaza was something that we call the policy of containment, which was that Hamas, we know, is there. We know they have evil intentions for us. We know that we fought every 2 years on average since we pulled out of Gaza in the summer of 2005 in a war against them, right? Mini wars, longer wars, but there's been wars. What we said to ourselves is that we have this policy of containment and it can work for a number of reasons, one of them being the technology. Now, the technology had 3 legs to it. Leg number 1 was Iron Dome. They have rockets and missiles, but they don't really impact us and they can't do anything to us because we have Iron Dome. So let them fire their rockets. We never really have to do it. We don't have to go in there to stop rockets because rockets are not a real threat, because we can swat them out of the sky like a mosquito. So we don't need to worry about the rockets. The second leg of the technology was the amazing intelligence capabilities we had, right? So we could hear everything. I mean, we saw when they switched SIM cards in Gaza, right? We intercept every phone call. We know what's happening. We have eyes and ears on everything. Now, that's all good as long as they're talking over those, lines of communication. And we even had tapped into their secure communications network inside Gaza, the one used just by Hamas. So we thought we knew everything, and there was nothing that could get past us. We neglected, at the expense of that, human informants. So, you talked about the hundreds and not thousands of people who ultimately ran into Israel, but let's talk about just the few dozen to a couple hundred who were in the know in the beginning. We didn't have one who could call up his Israeli handler and say, hey, I'm on my way. Get ready. Not one. I mean, and by the way, we didn't have. That's the reality. We had totally neglected old school intelligence using human assets. But then there was number 3, and that was we thought we were impenetrable. We had this amazing barrier, multi-layered fence, remote control weapons on turrets, on towers, cameras, phased array radars. When in 2014, they started popping out of tunnels, we said, no problem. We got this covered. We dug a wall to block the tunnels. We created a system to detect when they're building a tunnel, where they're building a tunnel, and even how they're building a tunnel. We were impenetrable. But as you said, not a single person crossed in a tunnel. They literally went through the wall or through the barrier. So how did they do that? What they did very smart was they studied us really well. And they knew how we conduct ourselves and what we do as a military when there is something that happens on the fence and when there is something that happens with rockets. So first of all, they did a couple of things. One was they normalized a presence along the border. You remember in the years running up, protests all the time along the border. People along the border who should not have been there. We learned after October 7th that even the female soldiers, the tatzpitaniot, the spotters, those who really paid the ultimate price, either by being murdered or being abducted, had been warning that there's more senior commanders, there's more of a presence along the border, and they were pretty much ignored. But we know that was one piece of it. The second piece was they knew that when they fire hundreds, if not thousands of rockets, as they did at 6:29 in the morning, the soldiers along the border do something very simple. They go into the safe spaces, right? They go into the protected areas in their bases. You'll remember this, Vivian, and our listeners and viewers can go back and watch this, but that really heartbreaking video from Nahal Oz, where you see the soldiers is in that concrete slabbed protected area, because that's where they had mostly gone because of the rocket fire. So they leave their manned stations and they go into those safe spaces. The same happened in the bigger bases like Re'im. They go into the command center, but they leave the border area and they're not there. So when Hamas does that, it knows that the soldiers along the border are distracted. By taking out the cameras, they can't really see what's happening. And we have GoPro videos from the Hamas guys themselves. Literally within the span of just 4 or 5 minutes, they are from the houses that they were having that last cup of coffee in. And they're at the border blowing a hole through. And then what they do, very smartly, they go straight to those frontline outposts and they cut the communications and they attack them. And then what they do is they bog down the soldiers in those outposts. So they're now fighting for their own survival. So imagine you're Rosenfeld, Brigadier General Rosenfeld, the commander of the Gaza division. You're in Re'im. You're the man who's supposed to mount the offensive in response, to the defense, to repel the attack. You are bogged down inside your command center because your base is under attack, right? And you have no way of communicating with Tel Aviv because they've cut your communications. You have no way of seeing really what's happening on the border because you don't have cameras. So it was old school, but also sophisticated all at the same time.
Yes, a former career Army man said to me the brilliance of the Hamas attack plan was its simplicity.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot to contemplate in that comment. It's quite profound. If you speak to people, as I know you have, in this area, people who live in the Otef, on the kibbutzim and moshavim that are right up against the border, people who live in Sderot, if you speak to the female soldiers whose job it was to have eyes on the border 24/7, 365, every inch of it, and about 100 meters in or 300 yards in minimum. I've spoken to so many of them, and I know you have, to a person. Every single one has said to me, we weren't surprised at all. A friend of mine who lives on Kibbutz Re'im, he said over and over, especially in the year leading up to October 7th, he was going in to see the IDF personnel who were stationed near his kibbutz. And he was like, this is crazy. It wasn't just near the army bases. It was all along the fence. There were constant, attacks, surges, I'm not sure what you call them, but large groups of men coming right up to the fence, fearlessly, sometimes hurling smoke bombs, often with other weapons, and taunting. That, as you said earlier, it just became part of the normal routine. And so there was no big deal. And that was a very smart strategy as well. And as we know, General Haliva, Aron Haliva, who had a very senior role in the Southern Command, head of military intelligence, he has been quoted as having said that Hamas are just a bunch of punks. These are, they think they can storm Israel? Fantasies. And that was in response to repeated reports from the female soldiers saying, okay, this is kind of next level. They're building replica guard towers. They're building replica kind of little Potemkin villages of kibbutzim, complete with the gate that they have to storm and the guard they have to shoot at the kibbutz gate if there is one there. The Tetzpitaniot, the female soldiers, felt this is not normal drilling. Plus, apparently they moved much closer to the fence. It was just a direct taunt. And Haliva's response was, bunch of punks.
When you look back now and you look at what we knew, it was all there. There was nothing that should have surprised us. The Tatzpitaniot saw it. Later, we looked back at Telegram. They had posted all these videos on Telegram of how they're storming mock bases, how they're kidnapping people. I mean, it was no secret what they wanted to do and how they were preparing to do it. I think what was the challenge for us was, or the failure, was how we were so in love or in belief of this idea and this conceptio, what we call it here in Israel, that Hamas did not want war, was deterred. Hamas wanted economic prosperity, that we had the right defenses, that if there would be something, we would have intelligence. And if we didn't have intelligence, we would have offense. And if we didn't have offense, we would have soldiers. And all of that was wrong. And what we have to also say, though, is that this prism through which we looked at everything that had to do with Gaza, and I purposely say we because I feel it's a national failure across all layers of society. You know, obviously, starting with the political echelon and the military and the intelligence folks. But I think even as somebody who's been a journalist for a long time here and had, you know, my beat at one point for over a decade was the military beat. I was at these briefings with people like Khalifa himself and with the chiefs of staff over a period of many years. And I would be in those briefings and, you know, whenever they'd get to Gaza, it was everything's okay. They don't really want war. We got it under control. We kind of just like nodded and moved on. Right. And we were all wrong. I mean, it was so, you know, this failure is really of national proportions. But I think that the prism through which everything was looked was that, you know, even if they're doing that, even if they're saying that they don't really mean it, we thought we knew better than they did. And that's the real challenge here, Vivian, is because you think about how the war might be ending soon, and hopefully it will be ending soon. Where do we go from here? And how do we prevent this from happening again? Because our enemies aren't going to go away, right? They might change form and name or shape, but they still are going to have evil intentions. And how do we not fall back into a trap where we say, you know what? We know better than them. We don't have to believe them. We're prepared. How do we not fall asleep again? That's what has me deeply concerned.
Yeah, I share your concern, especially since we're here 2 years on and we still have in the political government the same people running the show.
Yeah.
And still kind of, saying, well, you can't blame us. We didn't know. No one told us. No one warned us.
Or Bibi's comment, no one woke me up in the middle of the night,
Exactly.
right?
But as you point out, Prime Minister Netanyahu was very proud of what he considered to be his brilliant approach to the threat from Hamas, which was the conceptio in Hebrew, the containment.
Well, he was the architect of it all. It was his policies that were put into effect. And, the Qatari money is one perfect example. But Netanyahu, that's why even, of course, people say to me all the time, but he wasn't woken up, right? And my answer to that is it possible that had he been woken up and been told the SIM cards and the uncovering of the rocket launchers, that maybe he would have said something different? Maybe. Doubt it, because he believed just what the chief of staff believed when he eventually made the call. It's more likely a drill than an attack. He would have consulted with his security chiefs and they would have told him, and he wasn't going to go up against them. I mean, let's remember, Bibi before October 7th, and even after, by the way, in the immediate aftermath, had to be convinced to send in the ground forces, was very hesitant and did not believe it. And even in his own book, his biography that he wrote, right, his autobiography, Bibi, as it was called,
right,
he writes there that in 2014, when Bennett and Lieberman tried to push him to go into Gaza, he knew that they were wrong because we had bigger fish to fry. We had Iran, we had Hezbollah. That was one of the key tenets of the policy of containment was Hamas is down at the bottom of the totem pole. And, I met with a lot of these ministers and a lot of these members of the security cabinet over the last 2 years. They all give me the same answer when I ask them, what surprised you here? And they were all shocked by, this was Hamas. We didn't realize Hamas could do this. I mean, Hamas was telling us that they could do this. They were showing us that they were ready for it. What does it mean you didn't believe? We were too focused on the other threats. And I kind of understand it also. I mean, if you looked at the threat matrix, Iran is, of course, the greatest. Hezbollah, we were told, had 150,000 rockets and missiles. Hamas was much smaller, and we thought we were protected. We were wrong.
And I have to interject and raise this issue because you and I have had this discussion many times over the years, even before October 7th. And your position was always that Hamas does not represent an existential threat to the state of Israel.
Yes.
And I was a little more skeptical, maybe a lot more skeptical. I may not have had your knowledge with respect to weapons and all of their capabilities vis-a-vis ours. But what really bothered me, caused me to really question the premises of the conceptia, the containment theory, was, gosh, I'm losing track of all the wars and skirmishes. It was May of 22 when Palestinian Islamic Jihad was hammering Tel Aviv and central Israel with rockets. And we were told at the time, oh, don't worry, this isn't Hamas. This is just Pidge. We've got this and we can shut it down. And I'm thinking, really, nobody moves in the Gaza Strip without Hamas knowing. And in fact, that's one of the kind of basic kind of ideas kind of underpinning the containment theory is that we've got this deal with Hamas and they're going to control it. And all of a sudden, we're being told that, oh, Hamas isn't involved, but just Pidge is shooting rockets. That just doesn't work.
And by the way, that wasn't even the Netanyahu government. That was the Bennett-Lapid government. In other words, everybody, that's why I say it's literally everyone, because everyone bought into this idea. It was the Bennett government that was the one that increased the number of Palestinian workers from Gaza under the premise or the belief that no, that if we give them more money, if they have a better life, they aren't going to want war. So we all got it wrong. Everybody got it wrong.
There's another point that I think we should touch on briefly, and that is because of our fabulous wall, because of our technological superiority and all kinds of other things, and this arrangement that we worked out with the Qataris to keep the money flowing, there were significant changes made with respect to the capabilities of the kibbutz security forces and units, and how accessible their weapons were and weren't. Can you touch on that for a moment and just explain what changed, why, and what the impact of that was on October 7th?
Yeah, I mean, look, you take kibbutzim like Kfar Aza or Be'eri, places where they had the weapons stored in what's called the nishkiya, like an armory, and long guns were not allowed to be held in people's homes. So some people had pistols at home, but they weren't allowed to hold the long guns, the M16s, or, the heavy submachine guns. They didn't have the protective equipment. That was all being kept in the armory. And then when the kibbutz came under attack to get to the armory, became itself a death trap or a challenge, which some people were killed trying to do that and were not successful. Part of this had to do with the fact that the IDF was the one who told them, no, you can't keep the long guns in your home. You have to keep them locked up in the armory. I mean, it goes to the extent, and we tell the story in the book, of this one brigadier general, Yisrael Shomer was his name, who was a division commander up in the north, a division of reservists. And he comes home, I think it was Thursday or Friday before that Shabbat, right before it was the holiday. And he comes home from his base in the north. He leaves his weapon, because he has a long M16 that he carries around with him. He leaves it up north, and he lives in Kfar Aza. And when the attack commences on October 7th, he's home. He goes out in his gym clothes because he was planning a run, and he takes a kitchen knife. Eventually, he gets his hand on a weapon. But, I mean, this guy's a one-star general in the IDF leaving his weapon up north when he's living on the border with Gaza, right? So, I mean, it illustrates to what extent this border was being looked at. I mean, you're right that there are people who said, we weren't surprised. We thought they were doing something, but it was so deep, this belief that they can never do it. Like they would never be able to get into the kibbutz. They would never be able to, get to Sderot or Ofakim. They would never be able to cross with so many people, even throughout the night when Ronen Bar, then the head of Shin Bet, feels that something's wrong, and he sends down that team. In his worst nightmare, they were going to cross in maybe at 1 or 2 points, maybe a handful. That was it. Not the thousands that eventually came into Israel. No one ever imagined that would be possible.
I think it's also important to mention that They had such detailed intelligence, Hamas. They knew in many places, for example, since we're talking about Kfar Aza, they had drawings, they had the entire kibbutz mapped out, the initial forces, the elite Nachba forces that came in, and they positioned a sniper right by the armory. And so as the security force members of the kibbutz ran to the armory to get their weapons, their long guns, as you said, they were picked off one by one by one. I mean, it was just a completely planned slaughter. And this, of course, was repeated on other kibbutzim as well. But I know of one kibbutz that I won't name, and the only reason that they were able to repel and stave off a much more severe attack was because they didn't keep their long guns in the armory as ordered. And there were quite a few places that said to themselves, this is crazy. And it was a small number of men who had the long guns in their homes.
And they were able to prevent, Yeah. Also, I mean, listen, also has to be said that some of the kibbutzim that were just a little farther away had that extra couple moments that gave them also the advantage.
That was the story with Kibbutz Sa'ad, which is actually a religious community as well, but they had received word. Let's talk about receiving word. We've heard so many times, every single testimony, I believe, and I've watched hundreds and listened to hundreds, every single person was shocked. Where's the IDF? They were telling their children, they'll be here soon, the army will come. Hundreds, thousands of people were calling everybody they knew, and everybody here knows everybody, right? And there was simply no IDF presence other than one or two very isolated incidents until kind of early to mid-afternoon. What do we know about what was going on in Tel Aviv at IDF headquarters in the Kiryat, in the pit, as they call it, underground?
Great chaos, right? I mean, that's chaos, confusion, anarchy. The success of the Hamas attack and the disrupting of the communications and blinding Israel, literally, and having those frontline bases under attack themselves, so them having to fight for their own survival, made it impossible, essentially, for the military to understand what was happening. That's been one of the real hard, painful events of that day, is that the military, and I think this is something that the military has drawn some lessons from, but it's tough for a organized army to just flood a zone, right? It doesn't work that way in an army, right? So, and you saw how many friendly fire incidents there were, even on that day, people who came down, took a weapon, so many heroic stories, brave stories, courage of people who just said, I got to get there and I got to help. And it's incredible. But when you're not coordinating, you don't know who the enemy is, and you don't know who it looks like, and you don't know where they are. That's not how this military is trained, right? And it's not how the Air Force operates. I mean, one of the tougher questions is, why didn't they just throw 2 Apache helicopters up on the border and mow down anyone who's trying to cross? I mean, that's not hard, right? You got those rapid spinning cannons underneath the Apaches. Just take out anybody who's crossing the border.
So why didn't they?
Because the Air Force doesn't know how to work that way. That's not how they operate. They need someone to direct them and to guide them and tell them who the target is. It's not like out of a Hollywood film that you just, you put up a helicopter and they just shoot at people. The military, for better or for worse, that's not how the Israeli Air Force operates. It's very strict and disciplined and structured. And that was to our detriment that day. I mean, you had stories, I can't remember now if it was Be'eri or Kfar Aza, where literally you had members of the Kitat Konenut, of the rapid response, I think it was Kfar Aza, who were wounded and dying and bogged down. And finally, at one point, a group of elite soldiers from the Shaldag unit were helicoptered in and came in and started to fight. And then 1 or 2 of them got wounded. Helicopter comes back to evacuate the soldiers. What about the rapid response team? Where were they reinforced? I mean, what was going on? It wasn't that they didn't want to save them. It's not that they didn't want to help them. They had no clue what they were doing. They had no clue. I mean, you know the stories like I do. The anger of the kibbutzim, I think it was Be'eri. I spoke to some people there who later leave the kibbutz and they see hundreds of soldiers standing at the entrance, just standing. And they're like, where the fuck were you guys? What were you doing? We needed you inside. What are you doing outside? People want to say, and I get this, a lot, and I've heard people say this, and you hear it on TV and you read about it. Conspiracy theories. There were stand down orders. There's somebody on the inside flipped a switch. I wish that was the case, because that would make it easier, right? People go to that place because it helps explain away this deep crisis, this deep mistrust now that we have. That's not what happened.
Talk about the event that you and I both know and you write about in your book. That morning at Be'eri, a call was made directly to the Prime Minister's office, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, we know, was listening and responded. What happened in that call?
A member of the Kitat Konanut of this rapid response team, who's literally fighting tooth and nail to save himself, to save his family, to save his kibbutz, handful of people, some of them have already been killed. And turns out that this guy has a cousin who's actually one of the assistants and advisors to the prime minister. And they get on the phone, and the prime minister is there, and they put it on speaker, and he is told that he's now speaking to the prime minister, and he says to them, "We're under attack. Hamas is here. You have to get here." I mean, Bibi is hearing it from the people who are fighting on the ground. Bibi says, "We got it. We understand. We're getting it under control." I mean, it's terrible and it's painful, and it's, even talking about it now 2 years later is still very raw for so many people. I mean, I'm just a storyteller. The people who went through this, the people who still have loved ones in Gaza, who are being held, the people who have lost their families in this war. This is a failure of biblical proportion that has to be thoroughly investigated and studied. And this book is just a drop in the bucket of what happened and what needs to be investigated here.
Well, if I may, you're a superb storyteller, and you and Amir did a really excellent job. And you did it in that first year of most of the work, when I think most people, myself included, were just reeling from the shock and enormity of it all. And you got in there and started digging. So in our last few minutes, Ya'akov, we sit here on the 5th. This podcast will be dropped on October 7th, on the 2nd anniversary of this horror. We sit here today hopeful, but very wary of the possibility that this Trump peace proposal, what I call the big, beautiful peace proposal, may actually bear some fruit. So I invite you to take a few minutes to draw lessons, conclusions, fast forward it to today. How is this playing out? That horror of 2 years ago, for many, the ongoing horror because it never ends, and we're still at war. And we're looking, maybe, are we, at some kind of peace that will settle on the Gaza Strip?
Well, I mean, I hope and pray that by the time this podcast does come out, this deal would have been reached, and maybe hostages will begin to be released. And under the terms of the deal, all the 48 who remain in Gaza, the 28 bodies and 20 who we hope are alive still, will come home. But, we can't know how that's going to play out with the talks that are supposed to start in Sharm el-Sheikh between Israel and Hamas, with the Americans and the Egyptians and the Qataris and everybody else. I mean, if this deal does go through, in my eyes, it is a positive development, of course, but not a bad scenario for Israel, not a bad deal for Israel. Not only do we get back all the hostages at once, but we also preserve a military presence in Gaza, particularly along the strategic Philadelphia corridor, which is where Hamas has historically smuggled in its weapons. That's been key. And, people talk about how maybe this deal could have been reached a year ago. I'm not sure that under the Biden administration, when this deal was being proposed, A, that it would have been all the hostages at once, and B, that we would have been able to keep a perimeter in there, which is going to be very important and vital for the security of the state of Israel. There's obviously the issues that the right wing has with this plan, which is the Palestinian Authority getting a foothold, and Donald Trump's declaration that he still supports a Palestinian state, which I can't for the life of me understand why people are surprised by that, when that's always been his position ever since he rolled out, and even before, but ever since he rolled out the 2019 Peace to Prosperity plan, where he also wanted a Palestinian state. So there's no surprise there. But I think that's also positive, right? I think that this new governing entity, if it can work, and I'm very skeptical that it will, but if it can work and it can govern and it can prevent Hamas from rebuilding and it can rebuild the Gaza Strip and de-radicalize the Gaza Strip, I mean, this is where we need to go. And this is the time to go there, right? Hamas has been degraded. It's a shadow of itself. When you look at the region, Viv, and this is, everything we spoke about until now, Benjamin Netanyahu is responsible for. He needs to be held accountable. And I want to hope and pray that in a future election, we will have a new leadership in this government, in this country, sorry. We need new leadership. And we need, and by the way, we need people who were responsible to be held accountable and pay a price. Just like the chief of staff and the head of the Shin Bet and the head of military intelligence, the head of the Southern Command, and the head of so many more jobs. They all went home, but on the political level, not a one. Not a one. I mean, that says something about what's broken here. So I want to hope and pray that happens. But I also recognize that the Middle East has been re-engineered under his watch, and he deserves the credit for that too. He deserves the blame for October 7th and the credit for what's changed. Iran on the defensive, its nuclear infrastructure destroyed. Hezbollah beaten back, Syria, Assad gone. I mean, and even in Gaza, if this deal does happen, this is an impressive achievement by the prime minister, even if he went into this reluctantly. So overall, I do think that there's room for optimism, potentially. We might be on the cusp of a new Middle East here that is possible. Now, for that to happen, though, we need leadership in this country that can take us there. It's definitely not this government. That's 100%. We could talk about who the prime minister could be or shouldn't be. That's a separate question. But it's not these guys, right? It's not Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and the ultra-Orthodox. We need a new government. Whether Netanyahu is part of it or not, I don't know. But a new government that can take us there and can lead us to take advantage of these opportunities that today exist. But we also need something else. We need a commission of inquiry. And if, as this war ends, and if it does end now, and hopefully it does, the first thing that needs to happen is a state-appointed commission of inquiry to investigate and get into every detail of what happened. How did this happen? What went wrong? How does a policy of containment get created, get cultivated, and become entrenched as the policy of the state of Israel? All of this has to happen, because otherwise we will be failing our children and our grandchildren. And if you want just one way that I know that's true, is we just had Yom Kippur, right? It was 52 years ago that the Yom Kippur War took place. A tragedy in of itself, a strategic surprise in of itself. We fought back, we held on to the territory, we defeated our enemies. And still, it's a painful moment in history that is still being prosecuted and debated 52 years later. So this isn't going away. We owe it to our future generations to study and understand what happened.
Amen to that. And we know that it's 2 days from now till when this podcast will be released, is more like a decade in most other places. So I will have the responsibility of introducing all of that in the introduction. But thank you again, Ya'akov, for sharing your insights, your experience, and everything that you learned and wrote about in that fantastic book, which I have to say is a page turner. Kept me up. Available on Kindle, everybody.
Everywhere.
Get it.
Everywhere books are sold while Israel slept. Got to push it.
Totally pushing it. All the information will be available on our website. Thank you for the really important work you guys have done.
Thank you, Vic.
When we did our interview in August, I asked Ya'akov later by text what surprised him most after he'd completed all the research. And he responded with this comment: how deep the state of complacency was, and how there was really no one who pushed back on the policies that were put in place. It was prevalent in the government, in the IDF, in the Shin Bet, the domestic security service in Israel. In addition, he wrote, he was surprised by the reliance on technology and how deep that went. The belief that Gaza could be contained without human interaction shows the gravity of the failure. On Sunday, I sent him another follow-up question. What stood out during your book launch tour in terms of questions and reactions that you did not expect? His reply? People are so curious. People are grappling with, how did this happen? And there's a lot of hatred of Israel today, and a lot of criticism of Israel, and people don't like Israel. That's one thing I definitely saw. The battle is far from over. Thanks for being here, as always. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Yon Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.